But this month, talking about scaling WordPress. So thinking about going from a little small website into a bigger website that's going to handle a lot more traffic. So I'm going to look at two aspects, a kind of more basic, cost-effective way of doing it, basic stuff, and then kind of more advanced tips if you really want to go and scale your website. Okay, so why scaling matters. You don't want to run into problems where your website goes down and you've got WooCommerce running, you're going to miss out on sales. You're going to miss out on SEO as well. If it goes down, Google does not like websites going down or things missing. So that's definitely bad street cred from them. Yeah, you want to try and avoid anything that's going to do bad reputation to your brand as well. Anything that goes down, people these days have got very short memories, very short, not memories, very short. Yeah, so they're just going to go off and do something else. So you really want to make sure that when you get traffic to your website, which everyone want more traffic, more sales, you want to make sure that the system can cope with that. So here's what I'm going to look at, kind of budget-friendly stuff that anyone can implement. Then we're going to go into kind of serious stuff if you want to take it from basic to pro. Some stuff about WooCommerce specifically, because I know a lot of people run WooCommerce. Things not to do and a real-world example. Okay, so this is part one. Just looking at the kind of the basic stuff that everyone can implement. Doesn't cost too much, if at all anything. I've got some notes here, so just excuse with me because I've had like massive client stuff over the past few weeks, so I've got my notes down here. So first thing you want to identify when you're looking to scale your website is to identify what existing bottlenecks are there. The big thing usually is plugins. So people love to install plugins. They install any plugins. It just works then. And then you'll tend to find maybe some of the bigger plugins when they start doing stuff, especially you've got 10 people on the website, 100 people on the website, start to slow things down. So the big thing to look at is have a look at all your plugins. There's some great tools like Query Monitor. You might not have heard of that one, but Query Monitor sits in the back end of WordPress. If you find your site's going slow, install it and have a look at what's happening. It identifies all the data and all the queries that are going back between WordPress and database, and it kind of has like a traffic signal. So it identifies really slow ones, and it tells you what time it is. It's got like a little red arrow. So if you don't know where to start, install Query Monitor, have a look. It'll tell you what WordPress is talking to the database and which plugins it's using to do that. So if you start to see that a query is coming back in seconds, which you should never do, then that's probably a good idea to have a look at that plugin, check it out, jump on the support forum, see if anyone else is having that problems, contact the developer, maybe think about using something else. So that's one of the big bottlenecks, especially when we scale up, is big plugins, big bloat, and not developed very well. The second one is images. So again, this is consistent with everything I do. Every client that I look at when trying to optimize the website, they're usually running something like 6,000 by 4,000 pixel websites for their thumbnail for the blog. Okay, and that takes a lot of time. You know, if you've got one person looking at that, that's going to the web server, it's downloading all that data, you times that by 1,000, or if you're in a marketing campaign, you're now hitting tens of thousands, that's a buttload of data, you know, that the server's trying to output all the time. So make sure your website images are optimized, totally correct size, and have a play around with the formats as well. The other big bottleneck is the WP options table. So every time you install a plugin that's got a setting, it stores these settings in the WP options database table. Now, after a while, that gets huge, really huge. And when you delete a plugin, it doesn't necessarily delete all the data from the WP options. So it just grows bigger and bigger and bigger. You've got things called transients as well, which is a little bit of database caching. So it stores values temporarily. WordPress is meant to clean it up, but it doesn't do that so well. So this WP option table just gets larger and larger and larger and larger. So it's a good idea to look at that and optimize that. And there's a few tools you can use. There's WP Optimize, and there's database, Advanced Database Cleaner and WP Optimize are the two ones. They'll actually look at the database, that particular table. They'll have a look and see what plugins you are around. It'll say you can delete these safely or not. So that's a great way to kind of really squeeze down the WP options because it does get so large. What am I missing here? All good. Yep, another way to have a look if your website is slow is to run some tools like GTmetrix or Lighthouse, standard tools, but it really does give you a good breakdown nowadays. These tools are really good, and it can tell you roughly what's running slowly on your website. Not really WordPress specific, but it can tell you roughly which areas are slow. And don't just run it on your homepage, run it on the pages that your customers are running as well as your about page, your contact forms, your checkout, just to make sure you kind of cover all those bases. So that's the first thing, identify what bottlenecks, what's really slowing down the website, and address that, and that will get you like 80% of the way for a regular WordPress website. Hosting. Hosting and server stuff, it's always a bit of a trial and error. When people start off, personal or business, they don't have a lot of money to do it usually, unless you've got like a big angel investor, but normally people are looking for stuff on cheap. WordPress is free, plugins are free, so server, people usually go with a shared hosting for that, and it's good, it's cheap, it works, which is great. But when you're looking to get traffic, major traffic to your website, shared hosting kind of falls over. It falls over because I think we were talking before everyone came in about Wix and Squarespace and Shopify being like a boxed system. So in order for shared hosting to work properly, they might have like 100, 200, even 300 separate websites all on one shared physical computer or rack. And what they do is they can limit resources to make sure that everyone gets like a fair slice of the one CPU, the one RAM. So if you're trying to scale something on shared hosting, you're probably going to hit a limit, you know, and it's going to go slow for everyone. So if you've got 100 people, it might be okay. If you get 10,000 people, no, they're just going to see it time out and stuff. Shared hosting as well, it doesn't allow you to tweak the environment. So you can't set your PHP value, you can't set particular server stuff. It's all in there just for everyone. Okay, so you can't manipulate the environment that you might need to do if you're tweaking your website to kind of go big scale for those. So although it's cheap, it has its downsides. The next part of that, so if you're not looking at shared hosting, the next would be a kind of hybrid version where it's not shared, you kind of got your own boxed environment. These are usually called managed WordPress hosting, so WP Engine, Kinsta, Flywheel, that sort of stuff. They're usually US based, they come with US pricing, but with Australian data centers. That's probably your best bet if you want to try and hit the server part. So if you're really looking to scale your website big, you can't be running it on a shared hosting. You run into all these problems. So you need to kind of step out of that mindset and say, okay, I'm going to have to start paying a little bit more for my website.
So for the shared hosting, would you say, because you said big, what would be like the big number? Like let's say on a shared hosting, let's say how many sessions, 100,000 sessions per month? Is that like already not going to handle the shared hosting? What would be like the threshold?
You don't know. And that's one of the problems. You have no idea where the thresholds are.
Okay.
So it's within that company, they've set up their system to work like this. They've probably done some testing to know if they get too much, then it's going to fall over. So they limit everything access to that. So it's shared hosting is a very, very closed system. They want to make sure it runs all the time efficiently. They want to squeeze as many websites into a single rack or computer as they can to get them profitability. But you know, the more stuff you put in somewhere, the more problems you're going to have. And that's why you'll tend to find that shared host has more constraints than any other type of system. So it sounds great on paper and bills. So $20, $5 from GoDaddy, $25. Usually that's roughly about the price limit you'll see when you're using that shared hosting system. If you move into more managed systems, you're probably talking anywhere between 30 is probably really low, but probably between $60 and $90. And that could be Australian, it could be US. It depends on where the system's hosting. So it's a bit of a step up. It's gonna be a lot more money, but you just can't get away from the differences. With managed WordPress hosting, it's usually on what we call a separate instance. So they fire up a virtual container, virtual server. So it's got its own RAM, its own CPU, its own access to disks and stuff like that. So it's a lot better, and you can manage it a lot more. You've got more tweaks that you can go into the control panel. They've usually got better hardware as well, like WordPress specific hardware that you probably wouldn't see on a shared hosting system. It's just running a bland web server, they don't really care. They're just trying to minimize the operation to maximize the profits for there. So yeah, it's really important. It's probably one of the second most important thing to have a look at is good hosting.
So when you said the hosting is mostly the data centers in the US, so if I'm doing a website for an Australian customer, is it better to find a hosting server which data center is in Sydney itself, or in that case, can I use a shared hosting and amplify it or power it up with a CDN like Cloudflare?
I'll talk about CDNs in a minute, so I'll cover that. But generally, when you're looking at hosting, you want your data center to be as close to your main target audience as possible. I know speeds are pretty good, but latency is still a thing. It's not so much that the data centers are all new, it's the hosting companies, the big ones are usually US, which means technical support is usually US based as well. So if that's important to you, if you're a non-techie person, you need to call someone or jump on like a real person, not an AI chat agent. If it's in the US and your site goes down during Australian hours, is that important to you? Do you need to pick up the phone and call someone and say, fix it? Or do you have to wait for 6 hours before they come online US time? So there's lots of things that go into thinking about hosting. But certainly data center in Sydney, if your target audience is here, that's the best solution. Caching. So caching basically means taking a little copy of what you're giving out to the client. WordPress is a PHP application. PHP is a dynamic programming library, which means that if you've got a PHP page, all the different components, the web server is running all that PHP code through. It's looking at the database. It's grabbing the data in there. It's building up the HTML because web clients, web browsers only deal in HTML. So it's doing all this information backwards and forwards to the database. It's doing processing just to generate an HTML image of the page to then send out to the client. So that's a lot of work for it to do. What caching in Pages does is actually pre-renders one of the pages as HTML, stores it as a file, and then next time somebody comes along to that same page, it just spits it out. So it doesn't have to do all that backwards and forwards. It can save heaps of time on your website. It can really speed up fantastically. So having a cache is good. There's several of those. There's WP Rocket, which is a paid one. Then there's W3 Cache, I think it's called. There's Super Cache as well. There's 2 or 3 really, really good ones. It doesn't matter which one you choose. It's going to have a huge performance benefit on your website, especially if it's mostly static.
So paid versus unpaid. Big difference.
Yeah, in the tools and features that you get. WP Rocket is WordPress optimized. So it gives you WordPress options for those, a really specific way of how you can control the page caching exemptions as well. You kind of get it in some of the others, but the WP Rocket it's more branded. It's a better UI. It's better usability. The W3 one, it's got everything there, but it's got everything like in a one settings page. Like you have to scroll for like three years to get everything. With WP Rocket, it's fully documented. It's got help as well. So if you're not technical, then you can give them a call, and that's kind of what you pay for.
And also with the caching, with the logged in users, for example, WooCommerce website, it kind of shows the same copy to the login users as well, where they see that they're logged in, but when they land up onto the homepage, they are logged out because of the cache.
Yeah, so page caching works fine for static stuff. So your about page, your services page, your product images. Once you start doing dynamic stuff, like you log into a dashboard, you're doing a checkout, you don't want caching. If you're looking for a plugin to do that, it needs to be able to have exemptions. You need to be able to say /checkout, no, just don't cache that. /dashboard, /profile, that sort of stuff. You want to list all the dynamic stuff and say, I don't want that cached. Otherwise, you're going to get problems with that. So make sure that those are exempt. And so that's page caching. You should definitely have a cache plugin. It'll really speed up your website. There's another caching. It's called object cache. So these are systems that are on the server. So the 2 popular ones are Redis and Memcached. So what we mean by object is SQL queries, the data that WordPress loads in initially. So these are all stuff that WordPress needs to know about: the database table name, the server name, where the options page are, things like that. So it loads in this stuff automatically, and it tries to store it in the server memory. But what we can do is we can improve that. We can go to our hosting. We can say we want to implement Redis or Memcached, and then it stores that stuff in another system, but it's still memory. It's like RAM. Okay, really, really fast RAM. So rather than get WordPress to do it with database calls and stuff, then we can just grab that from memory storage. Really good for WooCommerce as well, for storing things like cart and session information. You put that off into RAM, it will really speed up things. So have a look at that, the paging objects. But caching is really, really important if you want to take that your WordPress to that kind of next level to optimize. We talked about CDN, or CDNs was mentioned. So CDNs are a little bit different from caching. They're more of a global cache. So whereas caching we're talking about, that's kind of all on the server infrastructure. CDNs store a copy of the web page up on different locations all the way through the planet. So if your target audience is international, CDNs are a really good way to get that information quickly to them. Otherwise, if someone's one of your customers is in the UK and they're trying to do a checkout on your Australian WooCommerce, then that's data is going to go all the way to the Australian server and then wait for it to go all the way back. So we might be talking a few milliseconds, but then if we're talking about scaling, try and do that with 10,000 customers online, that starts to add a lot of delay. So what we can do is we can offload that, that work that the server's doing and then store cached copies of our pages on networks throughout the globe. So when a UK customer comes and has a look at your site's about page, it's not actually reading it from your web server in Australia, it's downloading it from a cached copy in the UK. So it depends on which service you use. Two of the popular ones are Cloudflare, which has a free tier. And then the one that I use is Bunny CDN. I use Wordify as my hosting, and they have a partnership with Bunny CDN. So they do the same thing, but you can offload images as well to CDN. So rather than download big images, if you're maybe a photographer or something, then you've got to have big images on the website. Implementing a CDN is going to be really quick because it's not hitting your server, just downloading local copies.
So the majority of your customers are Australian based. This is not that, but
it can still help in other ways. So they can do things like they can stop denial of service attacks as well. So if you're signed up to something like a CDN, even though your target audience is in Australia, your server's in Australia, they'll still have an Australian site that will store a copy of your website or some of the data, which will be faster than going to your host and going back. Again, with caches, you don't want to do dynamic stuff. So your WooCommerce checkouts, profiles, dashboards, something like that, you want to exempt that because that needs to be read. In fact, you have to be careful because if you don't want it to cache that information, you certainly don't want somebody in the UK having to look at some Australians checkout stuff. So you want to be careful not to do dynamic stuff when you're doing CDNs. Database and media optimization, we talked a little bit about that as like bottlenecks, but you really need to go and do the dirty work and actually get it done. So database optimization, that's looking at the tables, making sure that there's no old stuff there. So again, those tools like WP Optimize can identify old stuff that's stored there. Make sure you're regularly removing transients because if they build up, they'll be a big bloat for those. For media optimization as well, we're particularly talking about images there. So ensure that your images are resized properly. If your biggest image on your website is 1280 by 720, don't be uploading 3000 pixels because that's just extra work for the server. If you can, try and use WebP. WebP is a different format. It's not new, it's about 10 years old, but it's just been embraced by WordPress. It saves a lot of pixels and storage data in your images. So PNGs are probably the heaviest. So if you've got images that got lots of text and details on it, you might want to save it as a PNG because, for clarity. JPEG is usually the default that people go to, not the best quality like the one under that. So it's still that your human eye can't detect the loss. But WebP can, under most circumstances, reduce even a JPEG by about 30% more without the human eye seeing any difference. So if you convert all your images to WebP, you're going to save a whole heap of speed and time on the website. Probably one of the biggest areas you can do for that.
And what about SVG? WordPress is not compatible with SVG images?
SVG?
Yeah.
Yeah, not by default. You can get a plugin to install if you really want SVGs. So you don't know what SVG is. They're called scalar vector graphics. It's basically math that creates the image. Again, not appropriate for everything. It's more, diagrams and things like that. But they're really, really small because they're just a text file. And they can scale beautifully without any pixelization, which is great. However, SVGs can contain malware. So people can upload SVGs as a text file and include malware and then run them from your website /WP content /01s. And so, yeah, you've got to make sure you've got some malware scanning like WordFence or something security that's scanning all the files in your media folder, just to make sure.
And also, you know how WordPress automatically creates thumbnails and another size. Is that a requirement of WordPress, or is that any way we can stop that from?
You can, if you go to the media settings, and then for each thumbnail, there's 3 thumbnail sizes, just put the size 0 and 0, 0 and 0, 0 and 0, and WordPress won't create those thumbnails if you don't need them.
Is that a good strategy for performance, or does it help with anything?
Yeah, if you're really image-based, it's certainly going to help on your disk size for those. If you don't need them, you might as well just get rid of them. Yeah. I think I've covered everything there. Yep. Okay, next. Monitoring alerts and load testing. When you're scaling your website, you need to make sure it doesn't fall over. And this is where the monitoring part comes in. So you need to be able to get alerts. You need to be on top of that. You don't want a customer to call you and tell you that your website's down. There's monitoring. There's lots of different software you can use for that. I use Manage WP for that. It's got its own little ping alert in there. You can also use Status Cake, Uptime Robot, which I've used in the past as well. What they do is they set out from their servers, they ping the website, and if they don't hear a good response back, then they can send an email or a text message to alert you that the website's down. And it gets fancier and fancier. So what I do is I ping all my clients' websites. I actually look for a specific string that I know is going to be on their homepage, because if the website crashes and a PHP error, it's usually called a white screen of death. Yeah, you don't see anything, it's just a big white screen. Technically, the web server is still running. So even if you're pinging it and the alert's listening back, going, oh yeah, I got a good response there, even though you can't see anything. So what I do is I always use a string with my clients and test that string is coming back. So it might be an H1 tag, or it could be the meta tag or the meta title. So that yes, it's getting a good response, and yes, there's a bit of code on text on that website, so I know it's up and running. So WP, Manage WP, Status Cake, Uptime Robot, these are all good things. When you go into the big scale, you probably want to be looking at kind of more specific stuff like RAM and CPU and database responses. For that, you want to set up a tool called New Relic. So it's not WordPress specific, it sits on the server. It has a WordPress module. But if you're into serious scaling, like thousands of users or doing media campaigns, you can set thresholds of when the RAM gets too much, when the CPU is spinning up too much, when the database is being too slow, within like milliseconds. A New Relic can send you an email or a text alert from a server to say, the server's getting stressed, it's eating up too much memory. You need to, it's like almost precursor to it falling over. So you can get that information and go to your web team or your host and say, look, I'm planning on doing this marketing thing. It's at 75% already. I don't want it to fail. And then they can put stuff in place. So that's more kind of server monitoring when you're really looking to scale up. If you are thinking about going big, if you're going to be doing ads or marketing, especially things like radio or TV, you want to make sure that you are thinking about how much traffic is going to come on your website and if it's going to work or not. And the way you can test that is through something called load testing. So load testing is a tool, and it simulates how many people are doing particular actions on your website. Don't just test the homepage, test something that people are actually going to be using. So if you've got a WooCommerce site, simulate the checkout, or simulate a registration, or simulate a contact form. You know, these tools allow you to ping your website with 100 people up to 1 million people, you know, to see at what point is it going to fall over. So you kind of know where your threshold is and what you then need to do to kind of, you know, really scale up for that. But load testing is absolutely essential if you want to kind of go that extra mile. There is a tool called K6.io. I think it's K6.io. And that's an open source software. You download it on your PC. It's command line, so you have to kind of get a bit dirty in there. But you can then write test scripts and this whole documentation, and it allows you to simulate all those different connections. K6.io, I think it's called. Yeah, same thing. There's lots of different tools. Yeah, but this is open source and it's free, which is good. Yeah, so make sure you're doing that if you want to ensure that your website holds up to a certain amount of traffic. Okay, that's all the basic stuff. Most of it's free. We'll kind of look more into the advanced stuff now. So this is really if you want to scale up with ads and proper marketing efforts. Okay, so there's two ways of scaling up. So scaling your website. One is scaling up, and one is scaling out. So scaling up is throwing more CPU and more RAM at the web server. So nowadays, you don't usually get a physical server. It's usually a virtual one. So you go into your hosting panel, you can choose how many CPUs you want, how much gigabytes, terabytes of RAM that you want. But you can only go so far. You can only put through so much at a particular, even a virtual server, until you hit a threshold limit from the server. So that's scaling up. Most people, if they're serious about performance, they will scale out. And what that means is adding more infrastructure and more monitoring software. So things like spinning up another web server instance. And then you have something called a load balancer. And it has a look at which web server is really struggling, and then it sends traffic to the other one that's not struggling. So that's what a load balancer does. So that's kind of scaling out. We're thinking about adding extra stuff, an extra database maybe for that. So two very, very different. Scaling out is infinite as long as your credit card can deal with the cost. You know, scaling up has its limits. That's kind of, yeah. So scaling up is upgrading all the equipment up to its maximum, where scaling out is adding the more stuff on ad infinitum. There's database strategies that we can use. Let me just go on this one. Yep. So there's a couple of things you can do with databases when we're thinking about scaling out. One is we can add multiple databases. So we can have one that's the read and write. So with WordPress, we always need to write stuff to the database. Okay, so we need at least one way to store stuff. So if people are registering, filling checkout forms, you know, we've got to store that data somewhere. So we need to have one master database that's a read-write, but we can have read copies as well, and we can place them on different servers, and again, use some sort of balancing tool. WordPress has a plugin that does this. So you can then purchase multiple databases, and it has a copy, okay? And then the servers just look at different copies. So again, it's a little bit of a load balancing, and that's specifically just for the database for that. So that's one way. If your database performance is poor, is to spin up extra instances and spread that load. Another one is called sharding. Now, sharding is when you take a bit of the data from the database. So it could be, for example, for WooCommerce, it could be order data and customer data, and you put that specific data in a database. Okay, so just that data. And then you have other data in other databases. So it's segmenting the actual data itself. And then, so when WordPress gets that information, it looks out just to that database for customer and orders, and it looks out to another database for other stuff. So that's sharding. Now, I mention it because it's useful when you're doing large scale, but not particularly for WordPress. WordPress doesn't natively implement sharding because WordPress uses a MySQL database or a MariaDB, and that database doesn't really support sharding. There's what called third-party proxies that you put on top or in between that you can shard data and map it to different places. It's that kind of a halfway house, But yeah, WordPress doesn't really natively support sharding. But you could implement that if you go into headless WordPress, and I'll get to that in a second. But just putting it out there, it's definitely one strategy if you're looking to like major scale up your website. Okay, elastic infrastructure. So this is the best part of scaling out. So this is where you set up the whole system where it's we talk about load balancers. So all the traffic's coming in. You've got software or hardware that looks at the traffic and it spins it out to different bits of hardware. So this is like the big way to scale up. It's like looking at, you know, when you're doing radio adverts or huge marketing campaigns, that you want to have a dynamic system that when you switch on those adverts, when your radio or TV ad is going out, that this system, it listens to incoming traffic and it spins up stuff on its own. So you've got maybe 1,000 regular users to your website. Your TV advert goes out at 7 p.m., you know, on Saturday or Thursday after MasterChef, whatever it is, you know. This software is listening and suddenly go from 1,000 to 10,000 or 100,000. This system will then spin up other web servers. It'll then spin up other database systems and it'll balance all the traffic out towards it. So the system scales out for demand. And then whenever people have done their thing or they're going back after the advert to look at the second part of MasterChef, then when that traffic drops, the system will spin down all these instances. And you pay for what you use, basically. So it's like a per instance, it's a per traffic. So the more traffic you get, the more cost, but then when that traffic goes down, the cost minimizes. So whereas scaling up, you'd be throwing like lots of money, it increases CPU and RAM. That's there all the time. Even if, you know, it's 3 a.m. in the morning, you've got 2 visitors on your website, you're still paying $700 a month for this huge server that's, you know, beefing away and doing nothing. Whereas the elastic stuff scales out and then shrinks back. So it's probably the best way to go if you're really serious about increasing your website scalability. This is the Amazon one. So again, you're kind of used to just your website running, which is just one thing. Now we're talking about the big stuff. We've got lots of different software and hardware in place. So we've got users that come through, Amazon Route 53, that's looking at where they're going, all the URLs that they're going to. You've got Amazon CloudFront, that's making the decision as to which services to use. You've got your elastic load balancing, and then that's got the auto scaling, so it's spinning up web servers and databases in the back end. You've got CloudWatch, which is listening for errors and stuff as well. I have no idea what DynamoDB is, probably some sort of database version for that. But you can see here it kind of scales up and down. So that's a more complex setup and infrastructure, but that's the infrastructure you need if you're really serious about getting lots of traffic. You know, 10,000, 500,000, million type users. You need this type of stuff. So WordPress can sit there. WordPress can work on Amazon. It doesn't need to be Amazon. It could be Microsoft as well, or a bespoke system. They've all got their own kind of versions of this software. But the more tech you add, the bigger team you're going to need to do as well. You're going to need to have specialists that know how this is set up and how it works, because each of these components has its own settings, its own way of working. So you need to know, you need to be across everything, and it's unlikely business users are going to be able to do that. So again, you're probably thinking about getting a third-party tool or service or person in to help you manage the elastic infrastructure. Offload heavy processes. So there's certain things on websites, even WordPress websites, that can slow down the web server. So if you're looking for high traffic, you want that to be responsive for everything. WooCommerce is a terrible product for performance. It uses a lot of stuff called Ajax, WP Ajax. So that's when the website doesn't refresh. It sends stuff, it talks to the server on the back end. So when you're looking at products, if you're adding them to the cart, if you're in your checkout field, WooCommerce does all that dynamically with Ajax. So it's always asking the server, it's updating cart totals, it's doing all this stuff in the back end. And all that traffic that's going in there, that's multiplied per user, you know, and it builds up the server resources. The server's still got to deal with it, even though you might not see the page refresh, you know, it's doing maybe 100 Ajax calls per one session. You multiply that by 1,000 people, 10,000 people, server goes terrible. So there's things like that that you might want to offload to different systems. WooCommerce comes with something called an action scheduler. It's a queuing system. So that's how it tries to get past that issue. So things it needs to do, rather than do it there and then with the web server, it puts it away to a queue. And then there's a separate process that manages the queue, and it gets round to doing stuff when it's got time and when, you know, when the server's got time to do it. So WooCommerce uses that action scheduler for a lot of stuff, and that can reduce the load on the server. But you can also use that in your own stuff. So rather than try and process stuff now and then, you can just put it off to action scheduler and get it to do it, not necessarily later, but later-ish in a styled version. Another good example of this is emails. So a lot of people don't think about emails when they're growing their business and they're scaling their website. Is you might have an email list, you might have a number of users there, and you maybe send out an email to them. It could be on a report, it could be a regular news email, something like that. Every time the web server to send an email, it's processing it through the web server. So by default, WordPress uses PHP to send email out. So that's the web server's got to compose the email, send it out, do all that sort of stuff. And that's okay for 1 or 2 users. But if you've got 24,000 users or 100,000 users, 1 million users, then if you're sending an update to all your user base from within WordPress, the server's just going to die. Okay, I had a client years ago, and they had a newsletter plugin. So they were sending 3 or 4 newsletters a day to their client base. And it got to a certain point where the server was spending so much time trying to process the emails that the front-end website was non-responsive. Okay, it's just all the web server was doing was sending emails, you know, and it was backdated. So what we did was we offloaded that. So another example of offloading is Amazon. So Amazon's got services called SES, Simple Email Service. It's got SQS, which is a queuing system as well. So that means that WordPress is not, the web server is not trying to do that stuff. It's just offloading all to Amazon. So there you go, Amazon, you deal with it. And Amazon deals with all that sending and stuff. So if you do have things like that, you've got a large user base that you're planning to have, if you've got notifications that go out that WooCommerce and stuff send out, consider offloading all that sort of stuff onto different services. And that's going to let your web server do what it needs to do, which is serve web pages. I mentioned headless WordPress. It is a way of scaling up or helping to scale your website if you're looking for big scale, big traffic. What it is, it decouples the WordPress backend from the front end. So you're basically running 2 separate instances. So you've got the WordPress backend, and you usually have that private to an IP address so no one can touch it. So you can still go in and manage WooCommerce, manage your blog, manage something like that. But then you've got another static application, HTML application, that then sucks information from the WordPress database using the API, and it spits it out, you know, as at the front end. And because it's mostly just HTML or like a JavaScript framework, it's super fast and super scalable because it's not doing all that reading in the back end. And there's ways to really make that super fast. We can use things like I think another slide. No, you can use things like WP GraphQL. So WordPress uses SQL to the database to get information. So if you've got a big product like WooCommerce, it's got lots of tables. So when you're looking at checkout or people are browsing around or history and stuff, it's always got the database and reading all the information from that table. Or it needs to get the user first with the ID, and then it has to find the product and then the order number. So it's always getting information. WP GraphQL is a different way of asking for that information. So rather than do 4 or 5 different queries, GraphQL, if implemented, you can build up a query that brings back all the information at once with one database, and only the information that you need. Bad and long queries, SQL queries, is probably one of the most performance issues in WordPress When a developer is just writing a plugin, they're not necessarily thinking about super performance. They just want the data, you know. So maybe they're looking to get the order number or something, but maybe they're a bit lazy and they just get everything from the order tables, and not just the order ID, it's the title and description and all the products and stuff, yeah? All that data is coming back. Whereas if you implement GraphQL, especially in a headless WordPress, you're just asking for the exact information you need, and it's just bringing it back. So it's a different way of approaching WordPress, your website, but certainly if you're looking for big scale, headless WordPress could be a good way to go. And it allows you to have the freedom to develop your front end website whatever way you want. So it could be a JavaScript framework, it could be HTML, it could be an Android or an Apple app. So it's all feeding from the WordPress backend, but you've got freedom to scale how you distribute your front end application. Specific to WooCommerce, the WooCommerce is a bit of a nightmare. Out the box, it's a bit clunky. So there's ways of addressing WooCommerce and making it go a little bit faster. Here's some things that you can do specifically for checkout. Checkout's probably the heaviest thing when you're doing WordPress, because it's doing all that back-end information. It's looking for cart totals and getting order information and product information. So what we can do is you can disable a whole heap of AJAX features. So for example, if you don't use coupons, you can disable that particular lookup. So by default, it's going to look on your coupon every time. Why? So and again, you need to hit the documentation, but there's lots of things that it does in the back end. If you don't use that particular feature, you can just disable, and it's going to make things a lot faster. With checkout, you don't have to ask everyone for everything all at that one time. You can do a step form. You can ask them afterwards for stuff. You know, once they've processed the information, just get the information you need to make that sale, and then afterwards grab all the additional information for that. So minimize your checkout fields. We talked about server-side caching as well. There's ways that you can add what's called server-side calculations. So if you've not got dynamic pricing, if you're not doing particular tax, if you just like an all-in number, or you just have one particular region, then you can calculate totals on the back end and store them. So rather than WooCommerce dynamically, every time you change something, going and looking up totals, you can either disable that and wait to the end, or you can use server-side calculations and just bring that information back in, rather than ask WordPress to do all these queries all the time. And we talked about async queues as well. WordPress sends a heap of notifications by default. Even if you implement offloading to Amazon, even that one thing is going to help performance big style, or just turn off notifications, which is even better. So those are particular WooCommerce things that you can look at out the box, and just to help you speed it up a little bit. Also, now we talked about object caches earlier on. There are plugins that help you do this, or you can ask your host. What you can do is you can set up an object cache, maybe in Redis or Memcache, and we can store the sessions and cart management there. So your web server's not doing all that stuff backwards and forwards. It's then looking at a bit of memory, Redis, and pulling it out really quick. So it's not doing anything to do with the database or file system. It's just grabbing it straight from Redis, super quick. Queue orders, so emails and exports, we can queue that stuff up. It doesn't need to be done immediately. We can offload that to the action scheduler or some other way. So make sure you're doing that. Dedicated database just for order data. So we talked about implementing different databases. You could just have a read-only copy and grab the order data just from there, rather than the same big database everyone's using for everything else. You could do that. You want to keep your plugins minimal, so don't have 1,000 plugins. When WordPress loads each page, it's initializing plugins and plugin data, even if it doesn't use it. There's plugins you can use to try and remove that, but by default, WordPress is grabbing a whole heap of information just in case it might need it. Okay, so the least amount of plugins you have, the better it's going to be for performance-wise. And WooCommerce comes specifically with something called HBoss. That's been there for quite a few versions now. It's called High Performance Order Storage. So in the past, WooCommerce, along with all the other plugins, would store all the post types in the WP posts, and all the meta for that in the WP post meta. as like products and orders and stuff. So that's again just putting all in the one big table. If you enable this, it actually creates separate tables for customers, separate tables for orders, separate tables for checkout, that sort of stuff. So it gets it away from the WordPress stuff that everyone else uses into separate tables. Separate tables are always quicker to query as well. So if you're looking for order data, you don't want to pull order data out of your posts table, which is like 1 billion megabytes. You just want to pull it out of the order table, which is a lot quicker. So I would definitely enable HBoss in probably every WooCommerce installation now. It's got its own migration. So if you've got an old version and you enable it, then it will migrate all your existing orders out into the new tables for that. So definitely, that's a definite one to do if you're using WooCommerce. Okay, some things not to do, almost done. You can't run multiple caching plugins. That's just going to confuse the hell out of the web server and everyone else. So choose one caching plugin. You can still use a CDN on top of a caching. Caching is just server, CDN separate, but don't use multiple caching plugins. I know we're talking about foreigners, don't use multiple page builders either. It's scary the amount of clients that I go in and they've got Beaver and Oxygen and Elementor and Visual. So just choose one.
With caching plugins,
Yeah.
a lot of hosting, they already provide the cache on their cPanels, right? So is it a good idea to use it there and on the website?
Yeah.
What do you think is the best way to?
Yeah. So every host you go to, they're going to have some level of caching, even on shared hosting, because it makes their job easier. If you're going for a managed WordPress solution, they've usually got hardware that caches stuff. That's all at their server infrastructure. Having a software cache is again like another step up from that. So they're doing their thing, but then you're doing your thing in your own WordPress website. So caching, they're storing the flat HTML files. HTML files are super quick, so that's going to help. Otherwise, even though they're caching stuff, when it goes through to your WordPress application, it's still running PHP, and PHP needs to get this from the database and that. So it's still building that stuff up each time. If you don't need to do that, then you can just pass the HTML straight out. So yeah, you can run that. Yeah.
Is it more efficient to run a PHP through a VPS?
Right. I didn't talk about VPSs. I talked about shared hosting. I talked about managed WordPress hosting. VPS is kind of your middle ground, where you're kind of buying your own server with your own RAM and CPU. Yes, it's going to be better than shared hosting, but you got to manage that yourself. So you got to manage the machine yourself, or you pay the company for a managed service, which is usually $50, $60 extra per month. Because when you're buying a VPS, you're managing the RAM, the CPU, the operating system, the PHP version, the web server version. So you've got to manage all that stuff as well as your website. So yeah, VPSs were popular, probably still are, but I think from a business point of view, you just want to manage your website and you don't want to bother about managing all the cPanel and stuff on there. So if you're a techie, that's great. But if you're like a normal business user, I would stay away from VPS. Yeah, sure. No worries. Yes, don't ignore your WP options. Make sure you're trimming down your transients and all the old stuff that's in there, because that table just gets super big if you don't touch it. And yeah, too many bloated plugins and themes. Get rid of all the themes that you're not using. There's no need for them to be there. You can only use one theme at once. So get rid of everything else. And yeah, lots of plugins. People do it. You know, you start off with WordPress and you install a plugin, and then you find another plugin, and you know, it just grows. But make sure you're always reviewing the plugins that you're using. If you don't use it, just delete it and get rid of it. Yeah, don't skip on load testing as well. If you're really serious about scaling your website, you need to know at what point it's going to fail. And you can only do that with load testing. There's no other way. Well, there's other way. You can just leave it, let it fail, and then your customers tell you. But you know, if you're really serious about scaling your WordPress website, getting lots of traffic, you need to know at what point it's going to break, where it's going to break, and what you need to do to stop that. Okay, that's all from WordPress point of view for optimization. Here's a little case study. I don't know if everyone was around here, but in 2012, there was this nationwide sale. It's called Click Frenzy. So it was across the entire Australia, and it was a whole lot of specials from different brands, 50% off, 10% off, that sort of thing. It was the very first one, and on November the 2012 at 7 p.m, I think it went live. The website didn't even last 1 minute. It went from 0 traffic to initially 10,000 within a few milliseconds. And then it hit close to 20, 30,000. And the website just went, okay? So this is a case study on when you think big and fail really big. So it got so bad that it had its own hashtag, ClickFrenzyFail, and it did real damage to not only the ClickFrenzy brand, but IBM, who were the hosting partners for that as well. Like serious, as in people were questioning contracts that they had with the services because it's so bad. So here's what happened. They didn't do any load testing. Well, that's at the bottom. Well, first of all, they underestimated how many people would be interested in this. Everyone was. I don't know. They didn't actually do a report. So this is other specialists that have commented. So the people who did ClickFrenzy didn't do a forensic analysis, or if they did, didn't release it to the public. So this is what other experts have said. They underestimated how many people would initially go there. Okay, big time. There was a single point of failure. It wasn't a shared server, but it was a single server. Okay, so all the stuff we've talked about, that wasn't in place. It was a single physical rack in a data center. So one web server, basically. There was no load balancing and there was no scaling. So that was it. Just as one web server in here sitting there. So you can imagine this, and then 10,000 people try to log in here, dead. Okay, so no load balancing, no scaling at all. When you read through it, you're like, why? But they had no caching. There was no caching on the server. It went directly to the server, and then it was running whatever it was. So there was no caching at all. No CDN strategy. I mean, why would you? It's all Australia, right? Well, even caching, as I talked about, in Australia is useful, because it's taking the load off your web server and giving it to someone else, like Cloudflare or something. Experts has had a look at the web pages, and it was really, really focused on dynamic data. So there was a huge database behind with all the offers and stuff, that was on. So it's doing heaps of database queries, and again on the same server. No separate server for databases, just on the one rack machine for there. So thousands of bottlenecks with the database queries, and again they didn't do any testing at all. Nothing. They just built the system, switched on, and waited. So, what they should have done is the complete opposite. Honestly, it's what we covered tonight. Definitely, very first, identify bottlenecks. So if you've got dynamic data, that's always a big question. Have a look at that. Single point of failure. They had one rack. That was crazy. No load balancing, no scaling out, no caching. So they should have had all that switched on. It would have helped. And doing query optimization. Now, I know I've talked about a lot of stuff tonight. I kind of give you a very brief overview as to WP GraphQL. But if they'd implemented that, even just that one thing, the server might survive for another 10 seconds, or something, maybe not, maybe not. Yeah, and testing, lots of testing. So just this one epic fail, actually, when you look at it and analyze it, it's actually a really good fail from our point of view. If you're serious about scaling your WordPress website, these are things not to do, and they did it. So you can go back and read about people's analysis as to what happened and why it happened. But it's a sad day for them.